A great deal of crap happened during the early years. A lot of partying, fighting, and uncontrollable behavior that somehow became all too familiar with me. Funny, however, Dad became much more stable and started being a good influence on me. However, my sister Katie, Timmy, and I really put my parents through the ringer. The three of us often partied, smoking and drinking, while Timmy and I chose to scrape by life doing the bare minimum, which was a shame since Timmy was really smart, but didn't prepare himself for adulthood by studying and living up to his full potential. They still had more control over Katie, though, forcing her to complete the 4 years at St. Clair's Catholic High School, in which Katie later actually managed to get through college and get her nursing degree at Northeastern University. The people she hung with were much like our friends as they partied hard, and her best friend Patty ended up being pregnant and having a baby, even though she was at that same Catholic high school. They tried sending me to Catholic Memorial High School, which I attended for 2.5 years, but unlike Katie, I never graduated CM. I had a much different path to follow. Another time, when I was even younger, when I was in sixth grade, I remember we used to have rock fights. One night, while we were having a rock fight, I got hit in the eye with a rock and I got hurt pretty badly. Unfortunately, I rushed to the wrong hospital. I went to the ER and sat there for 4 hours. Then all of a sudden, my brother Michael came in and said, "Ma, you got to take him to the Massachusetts Eye Infirmary, a hospital which was well renowned." And so my mother listened, and they brought me down. Once I got to the Eye and Ear Hospital at Mass General, they took 20 minutes, and then they had scopes in my eyes, and they determined I had a detached retina. They said the course of action was for me to lay down for 2 months without any kind of motion at all, and they said that would probably make it fuse together. They were right. I had to stay in bed for 2 months while my retina fused back together. I remember my mom reading Charlotte's Web to me as I was in the sixth grade. My right eye, 3 weeks in, still was not focusing too well as I continued laying there in the hospital bed, heavily sedated, wondering if I would ever see through that eye ever again. Later, the beginning of the third week, on a hot June night, I decided to pull my right eye patch back and peek out of my bandages. When I did, I looked out the window, faced west down Storrow Drive, and made out a structure in the distance, what turned out to be in Kenmore Square. It was the famous Citgo sign out in left field bleachers at our famous beloved Fenway Park. I immediately called the nurse through the intercom, and she appeared seconds later. I was so happy. I remember my brain was bursting to tell her my good news, and that I could now finally see. She pulled the patch completely off now, with the room lights still dimmed, which then, at that moment, I was fully able to clearly see the iconic symbol of the Boston Red Sox baseball team's unofficial logo, the Citgo sign, lighting up in the distance with those iridescent lights that shone so colorfully and brightly all over the great city. What was somewhat coincidental, just that next year, the Massachusetts Historic Society decided to make that Citgo sign a permanent city landmark, a landmark with great personal significance to me. When I got out and came home one sunny spring afternoon, I was supposed to remain stationary at home with limited movement for at least another couple of weeks or months even until school started again. In the meantime, David O'Brien came over and started chatting with me. David, in the first place, was the guy that hit me with the rock. He first apologized for hitting me with this rock, and then he said to me, "I got punished for hitting you in the eye with the rock, and I had to miss a stupid Beaver High School dance." Well, the nerve of this fucking asshole. I ended up in the hospital for 2 months because of this shit. I flipped out and began punching him in the face as hard as I could. My dad ran down the stairs to break up the fight, but not before I got a few good punches in his face. Age 13 began for me by drinking on the weekends with my friends. Marijuana also became somewhat of a habit as well, as I began smoking weed with my brother down the Arbs. As we smoked a couple of joints my first time, I remember feeling very euphoric and had a sense of overwhelming excitement as I sat there stoned. This began a love affair I had with weed that lasted 10 years. One night, my brother and I, along with 6 friends, decided to break into my neighbor's house across the street. Their name was the Dragonettis. They lived on the Arboretum side of the street, so breaking in would not be very visible to our other neighbors on either side of the house. We climbed to the second floor window by climbing the trellis, which Mr. Dragonetti used to grow his own grapes to produce some of his crappy homemade wine with. When we first got into the house, we started to look downstairs to see if Mr. Dragonetti had any wine fermenting. We actually found some, but thought after tasting it, we better get off this and find the booze in the liquor cabinet upstairs. Just as Timmy and I opened the liquor cabinet doors upstairs, we actually heard our mother scream, "Chrissy, Timmy, time for dinner." We stopped in our tracks, looked at each other, and Timmy barked out orders to the crew to steal some booze and hide it up the arbs for the next night. The next day, Timmy and I went with our neighbors up the arbs, and we all went to the Motley Hill and walked down the hill where Pancake Rock stood. We climbed up Pancake and went to the other side where Weld Street divided the first arbs from the second arbs. Now stoked to see they had stolen about 14 bottles of booze, we all sat up there opening various bottles and began pounding straight alcohol. I began drinking straight gin, almost vomiting as I began pounding this whole quart of gin. We made it to my street and we sat on the Frane's wall when all of a sudden I did not feel too good. It was probably a good thing that I began to throw up because I had drank a whole crap load of this stuff. Mrs. Abisso, who watched me vomiting uncontrollably, did escort me from the Frane's wall, and she came to my house, knocking on the door, when my dad answered. They brought me into the kitchen as I threw up into a bucket provided to me by my very unhappy father, and Dad immediately knew I was drunk off my ass. I was still sick and throwing up as my dad began grilling me over and over again on how I got the alcohol. He kept it up until I just broke. I thought, if I could just tell him where I got the stuff, he would stop interrogating me and leave me alone so I could go to bed. I spilled the beans, and I spilled the beans on everyone. His response was strange, as he went across the street and got Mrs. Dragonetti and brought her to our kitchen, where I sat there still throwing up into the bucket. She looked at me as my dad told her what we did, still scolding me. She, however, interceded and came over and rubbed my head and said, "Poor, poor, poor boy." She was Italian, so she had that weird Italian accent. So she said, "Poor, poor boy. He's suffered enough. Don't punish him no more. He's learned his lesson." I remember at this point my dad pulling out his checkbook and wrote her like a $500 check. Well, Timmy got his ass kicked that same day just for this reason. Everyone, like 6 more dudes, all got into trouble because Dad went to everyone's house and told on everyone's father, just reported everything to everyone's dad. Normally, I would have never ratted on anybody. Never would have done that. However, I was so fucking sick. I just wanted all the interrogation to end. Dad's incessant cross-examination, and the only way to make it stop was admitting Dad everything. Boy, was Timmy pissed.